So that match or exceed the Commonwealth's emissions reductions targets. On that motion, Councilor Carlone.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor McGovern. Absent. Councilor Nolan.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Zondervan.
You're on mute.
Well, I took it off. Yes.
Motion passes 4 in favor, 1 absent.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk, and thank you to my colleagues. So I do have a couple of questions myself. I don't know if Councilor Sabrina Wheeler, did you have any questions or comments you would like to make?
I don't know. Thanks to the staff for their presentation. Look forward to talking about more.
Great, thanks so much. So let's see. So when we're talking about Guido stakeholders, that word came up a few times, and it seems like that's a separate but perhaps overlapping group with the net zero action plan stakeholders. Can you specify more who exactly do we identify as Guido stakeholders?
Seth, I'll let you speak to that.
So the BETO stakeholders are the property owners and managers who own or operate buildings that are subject to the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance. So we keep a covered property list in order to complete compliance of the current ordinance stakeholders that I'm referring to.
Got it. I do appreciate the additional language around equity and inclusion, and I would like us to consider whether we should broaden that definition a little bit, because at the very least, the tenants of those buildings are also presumably stakeholders in this process. And then, of course, the entire community are stakeholders in this process, because ultimately, as you've laid out very clearly, a huge chunk of our emissions, really the majority of our emissions, come from these buildings. So we all have a stake in reducing those very aggressively and effectively. So if we can broaden that definition and have more inclusive conversations around how we're going to approach that, that would be great. I do have some more specific questions related to the presentation. So you mentioned that we've kept our emissions level, and if we can look at that graph again, it did look like it went up and down a little bit, and I'm just really confused about that. I don't know if you have any kind of narrative explanation of why that is. Oh, you're on mute, Seth.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So in the graph, we see here the different sectors that are represented. So over time, there are variations in the energy and emissions consumed by individual sectors, and that's likely related to operational changes. We also see changes in the weather. And so the yellow line is what we would expect the emissions to be given the weather in any given year. So historically, emissions have been driven by heating. So in colder winters, we would see higher emissions, and in warmer, milder winters, we would see lower emissions. So this yellow line projects what we would expect the emissions to be in a given year. So for some of the more recent years, for example, 2017 was expected to be a lower emissions year because of that weather trend, and the data agreed with that essentially. So there are many factors that affect the emissions and those trends year over year. But the building operations in the different sectors and then the weather are two key drivers of that.
Got it. Thank you. And this data does include the fact that new buildings have been added during that time period. And so, I mean, it's not quite level. It did go up overall, but not perhaps as much as we would have thought. But is there any way to assess whether, you know, how much of that increase is due to new buildings versus, you know, how much have we improved the performance on the existing building?
Yeah, so one of the challenges in the net zero review process has been the disaggregation of data and associating emission reductions results with specific actions. So on the website, we do have the impact study, which did. So those actions where we can measure the impacts, such as increased solar installations in the city, which we track, the BUTO data, which we obviously track, some of the retrofit programs, which we track. So we have to do some kind of sleuthing to try to do that type of breakout. So the best way we have for existing buildings versus new buildings to track their impact would be the BUTO data. But of course, there's a delay in that data, and the building also has to fall under the BUTO threshold to report that data.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be useful in the future to be able to see that, particularly as we, you know, try to assess the effectiveness of the BUTO amendments going forward to separate out the new construction, which anyway increasingly will be net zero. So I guess it'll self-select out, but not all of it. And of course the labs might be delayed until 2030. So it might be useful to pull those out as we look at this data. I was excited to see that the state's moving forward on the net zero energy stretch code. Of course, that's itself been much delayed already. And I'm wondering now, I mean, you know, we're almost halfway through 2021. So, you know, how are we going to meet our 2022 goal if the state isn't coming out with these regulations for a year and a half? And then, you know, are we thinking that we would go through another stakeholder process in Cambridge before we would adopt those regulations, or is there any way to do some of that work in parallel so that we can essentially adopt them the day after they come out?
Well, so in terms of the mechanism to adopt them, so it would be the requirement at the state level through the new climate law is that the state establishes a net zero stretch code option that then communities can opt into, similar to that they've done for the current stretch code. So I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is in the city council's ambit. And so the city council could choose to adopt that optional stretch code as soon as it becomes available. And in the state law, there are specific requirements for not only the timing of developing that stretch code option, but also the process, which includes extensive stakeholder engagement.
Right, and that's what I'm concerned about, because I mean, obviously we could, I suppose, just adopt it in the city council, but we're going to look to you all as the experts in guiding us through that. So, you know, again, my concern is that if the state comes out with the language, you know, December 31st, and then the council says, okay, let's adopt it on, you know, January 2nd, and then, you know, we didn't meet our stakeholder requirements. So, you know, I don't necessarily need an answer right now, but just would like us to think through that process so that we are as ready as we can be to adopt it the day it is announced, because, it's going to be late, and that's going to delay our own targets. And then how do we anticipate the phasing? So in the net zero action plan, we've laid out a phasing of 2022 for small residential, 25 for large residential and commercial, and then 2030 for labs. And so I'm guessing, assuming that we're not going to adopt the net zero energy stretch code then to apply instantly to all the buildings. So how are we thinking about that?
I think we don't know the answer to that right now because we don't know how the state may process the different building types. So and whether it would be an option to adopt a stretch code for only certain building types. They may build in a phasing strategy, but we don't know that exactly right now. So it's a difficult question to answer. What our options would be. I would say if there's a small delay, the buildings that would under our current policy targets kick in 2022 would be small residential, so 1 to 3 unit buildings, and it is not a large amount of square footage that comes online in a given year in that part of the building sector, and the emissions would likely not be hugely significant. So I would say that's the impact of a delay of say 6 months or something would not be, it wouldn't be worth trying to come up with some other interim Cambridge only solution for such a short period of time.
Right. No, I totally agree, and I appreciate that nuance. It's really more about just meeting our targets, and even if it's one house, right, that gets built, it's not net zero. People are going to have to live in that, and somehow retrofit it. So, I totally agree that the overall emissions impact is presumably negligible, but in terms of our process and moving forward and really putting these requirements in place, I think it is really important that we do that with the utmost speed and urgency that we can muster, right? Not in terms of putting in alternative arrangements, but certainly in terms of adopting those regulations as quickly as possible under the law. Okay, that was really helpful. You mentioned earlier the community choice aggregation program and factoring in the supply and the carbon fund, and it all sounds really good to me, actually, to concentrate as many of these mechanisms into that one program. But I am concerned about, again, the timeline of how quickly realistically will we be able to do that. I mean, we've been talking about a carbon fund in Cambridge for over 10 years. At least I've been part of that conversation for over a decade, literally. So, how quickly can we leverage that mechanism? And if we can't, again, is it worth exploring alternatives?
So I think as the council knows, we're engaged in a process to look at the city's own municipal electricity supply and also potential opportunities for the aggregation to switch to a larger proportion or 100% green electricity. And that process runs through summer of next year, and it is intensive. We're very, very engaged in looking at all the options and all the potential mechanisms for not only the city's own supply, but strategies for incorporating all the customers that are in the aggregation. It's complicated, and I don't have a direction right now for how that could be achieved, but it is something we're looking at with a great amount of detail and expertise on our team, consultant team, to figure out what is possible and how can we do this.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes sense to me. There was some discussion during the budget meeting about the PACE program and some reluctance on the part of the city manager to adopt it. Is there any update on that discussion that you're able to share with us?
Thank you, Chair. We don't have any further update. I know you had asked two questions. One was whether there is some alternative mechanism that would achieve the same thing as PACE would, and we are not aware of any alternative mechanism. And in terms of the adoption of PACE, I think in Cambridge, the concern is what the city manager had raised, that he is very reluctant to adopt a provision that might have, even if it's a small possibility of a detrimental impact on some small residential properties. I think he's very concerned that we not have any provision that might put the city in the position of recommending something that might result in a foreclosure for a small residential property owner. And currently there isn't, as far as, in our conversations, there isn't a mechanism to separate out commercial from residential. So it's not, again, like we could go with one sector and not the other.
Right. No, I appreciate that. That is definitely a difficult challenge. Very good. Well, I think I'm out of questions for now. Unless my colleagues have further questions, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Councilor, yep.
I do. I'll follow up on actually something that was mentioned earlier, which is the idea of the energy use performance requirements. It seems like Boston and Washington and other cities have both the greenhouse gas emissions reduction and energy use performance. So let's make sure that we are at the cutting edge of that. Seth is saying no. I just want to make sure we include both, because as we know, as we think about infrastructure, it's unclear if we electrify all of our buildings, right? We also have to think about the capacity of the grid to handle it. That's going to be a major issue over the next 20 years as more and more buildings have no choice but to turn to electrification. That if they don't also simultaneously reduce their energy use, if we thought there were struggles before over the siting of substations, it's going to be even more challenging in the future. And I know we've discussed this before, but I just want to put it out there that let's see if there's any other city that is doing that. And then I had a data question, which is the Net Zero Action Plan 5-year review had a different number for the building total from 2018, significantly enough, about I don't know, 50 or 60,000 difference. And I'm just curious as to, maybe I'll just shoot you this question in writing, but we should have the same data in the different reports. So the Net Zero Action Plan 5-year report that I saw just from the building sector was 1.235, and the one that was shown today was 1.171. So I just don't understand that difference. It would be helpful for all of us to understand.
If you would send that, excuse me, if you would send that in an email, that would be great, so we can be sure to refer to the right numbers. Thank you.
Yes,
Chair, if I may just
it was my. Yeah, I did want to say that it was my understanding from what was said earlier that the energy use component is addressed both in the high standards that are being set in terms of the renewable energy offsets that are allowable, as well as in the offset per ton that would be charged for exceeding the emissions targets. And so that makes sense to me in terms of the regulatory mechanisms that would drive the incentive towards energy efficiency versus renewable energy offsets. But I think what would be helpful for the council and the public would be to be some analysis of that so that we can, ascertain for ourselves that that really would get the job done and that we wouldn't necessarily need separate energy requirements. Because I do understand, the discomfort that not having those requirements might generate if people aren't comfortable that the policy instruments we're proposing would actually achieve the same goal.
And if I may, real quick, I just want to clarify for Councilor Nolan, the head shaking was just to clarify what is in the Boston proposal, which again has not yet been adopted, but their current proposal as written is only based on greenhouse gas emissions.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Well, I really appreciate. Yeah, I'll let you speak in a second. I just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate the presentation and the depth of this conversation as always. And after Ms. Farouk, I think we'll have to entertain a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. This is not essential, but I just wanted to say, following up on Councilor Nolan's point about electric capacity, is that tonight at Planning Board is the first discussion from the utility companies starting at 6:30. So both Eversource Gas Electric as well as DPW from water sewer side, from sewer stormwater side and water department will be presenting this information starting 6:30 at Planning Board tonight.
Thank you. That, of course, is going to conflict, unfortunately, with the City Council meeting. So
That's
hopefully right. we can get a report on that after the meeting. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
On that motion, Councilor Carlone.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor McGovern, absent. Councilor Nolan.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Sabrina Wheeler.
Yes.
Yes. Councilor Zondervan.
Yes.
Motion passes, 4 in favor, 1 absent.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.